Welcome to Reading Bear. Today, we've got a story where OP buys a home for the old barn out back only for the HOA president to demand it be torn down. I bought the place for the barn. Most people who move into a planned community fall in love with the landscaping, the pools, the trimmed hedges that look like they got their edges cut with a ruler. I looked past all that. At the very back of the lot, tucked behind some old cottonwoods, there was a weathered barn that looked like it had stood through worse storms than I ever had. It wasn't pretty by the HOA brochure standard, but it was solid. Real wood, real posts, a ridge beam you could park a truck on. It reminded me of the farms I grew up around. I signed the papers and met the board the next week. They smiled the way salespeople smile. I paid the first year of dues and was told to review the covenants, conditions, and restrictions CC, rupees, because we all play by the same rules here. I read them that night. No pink fences, no livestock, approved mailboxes, and a whole section about outbuildings. I was ready to argue if anyone came for the barn, but there it was in black and white. Existing structures at the time of purchase were allowed to remain as grandfathered. I relaxed. I cleaned out the hay smell, put in lights, patched some siding, and turned the main bay into a workshop. I hung a photo of me as a kid, holding a paper target with ragged holes near the center. The first time I realized slow breathing actually mattered. That was my happy place. I mowed my lawn, waved at neighbors, kept my head down. Enter the HOA president. You know the type. New truck that only ever sees a spotless driveway. Mirror sunglasses at neighborhood meetings. Never actually holding a tool. Always holding a clipboard. He introduced himself by pointing to my barn first and me second. We'll need to talk about that. We won't, I said. It's grandfathered. He raised an eyebrow like I'd just quoted a law wrong. We'll see. It took a few weeks for the first letter. It wasn't a knock and chat thing. It was a certified mail thing. Notice of violation, with photos of my barn stapled on like mugshots. Unapproved outbuilding barn visible from common areas. Under article, whatever, all outbuildings must be in harmony of external design with the community aesthetic. Remove or bring into compliance within 30 days. I took the letter to the barn, leaned against the door, and read it again. The CC. Ours had that clause, sure, but it conflicted with the part that said existing structures were protected. I sent a response with a copy of the page that used the magic word grandfathered. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The second letter was longer. It cited a vote from a special meeting I hadn't heard about. The board had clarified that barns weren't considered grandfathered if they weren't in active agricultural use. The logic was cute. No animals meant it wasn't a barn for its historical purpose. Therefore, it was just an unapproved outbuilding. I had 60 days to take down the barn. That phrasing stuck in my head. Take down the barn. Not replace, not paint, not modify. Take down. I highlighted it, underlined it, and stuck the letter on the fridge like a kid's drawing of a house that's on fire. I showed up to the next HOA meeting. The president was already in full runway mode, walking people through landscaping violations like it was a crime show. When they got to my barn, he pulled up a slide on a projector with the words non-compliant structure over a picture of my pride and joy. I stood, asked for the mic, and said, calm as I could, "What specific rule am I breaking that supersedes the grandfather clause?" He smiled the way someone smiles when they've practiced it in the mirror. We voted to clarify the clause. The structure is no longer serving its original purpose as a barn. Therefore, it is an unapproved outbuilding. Therefore, it must be taken down. Taken down, I repeated. Taken down, he said. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I didn't vote. I went home, made coffee, and read the CC. Ours again. Then I read the county code. Then I read state law. Not because I love reading legal stuff, I don't, but because if someone wants to play rulebook, I'm going to learn the rulebook cover to cover. Here's something about these planned communities. The HOA can control paint colors and mailboxes and fences, but it can't override county zoning. And it can't override state preemption on certain things. My property sat at the very edge of the HOA map, where the developer had convinced the county to let them nibble into what used to be agricultural land. I still had a bigger lot than most. The barn had sat there before most of these homes were sticks in the ground. The county didn't care if my building was called a barn, pavilion, or a dinosaur. What they cared about was safety, setbacks, and whether I paid the small fee for change of use. There was also a little-known piece of state law that said associations can't restrict lawful and safe recreational activities that the state specifically protects. Local communities can make rules about noise, but preemption means an HOA can't tell you to stop doing something legal on your property just because they don't like it. I made 2 calls, one to a local land use attorney who has the personality of a bulldozer, and one to a range consultant I knew through a friend. The first call was about making sure the HOA couldn't stick a hook into me somewhere I hadn't looked. The second was about something I'd wanted since I was a kid, staring at that paper target, a private, safe, legal place to practice marksmanship on my own land. No public lines, no strangers flagging people with muzzles, no range officers yelling, just me, the tick of a timer, and the slow breath I learned as a kid. Before anyone gets excited, I didn't fire up a skid steer and start piling dirt like a maniac. I did it the right way. The consultant came out with a laser rangefinder, a notebook, and a cautious hat. We walked the lot, measured distances, looked at neighbors' houses, checked the lay of the land, and the direction of the prevailing wind. We talked about backstops, side berms, baffles, and how to keep sound from bouncing around. He gave me a plan that was compliant with county guidelines and industry best practices. The county planner looked at the plan, looked at the state preemption language, looked at my parcel, and gave me a letter that said, "No rezoning required. Change of use from barn to private recreational structure. Approved." I framed that letter before I framed anything else. Then I started taking down the barn, not with a wrecking ball, with a socket wrench. The CCRs didn't define takedown. That was their mistake. The violation letter didn't say demolish. It said take down the barn. Legally, a barn is a structure used for agricultural storage or livestock. So I removed the stalls. I took down the loft. I pulled the big sliding doors off their rails and donated them to a guy who repurposes wood. I stripped anything that made it a barn in function. I removed the hay hooks and the feed troughs and the tiny hinged window the president fixated on in his emails. What remained was a sound, permitted building with a roof, posts, and a slab, now officially a private recreational structure, which the CCRs allowed under a different section with board approval. They had the right to comment on colors and trim. They did not have the right to tell me that the activity inside, so long as legal and safe, couldn't happen. Inside, the contractor installed baffling that looked like giant black honeycomb panels. At the far wall, an earthen backstop rose like a gentle hill, contained behind a heavy-duty barrier. There were no open sightlines to a neighbor's house. Nothing left the structure. Sound absorption killed the sharpness of report. It was quieter than a roofing crew. If you walked by on the path behind my lot, you might hear a dull thump now and then, like someone closing a trunk. When it was done, I sent the HOA a notice by certified mail. Per your instruction to take down the barn, the structure is no longer a barn. See attached county letter regarding change of use to a private recreational structure. Exterior paint has been selected from the approved palette. Trim is color XYZ per design guide. Please confirm architectural compliance. I got a reply that was basically a scream typed with fingers. They scheduled an inspection. The president came out with a board member and a person who called themselves the architectural chair, which, based on his sandals, meant he owned a level. They walked around the exterior, snapped photos of the new trim, stared at the missing hayloft window like they were mourning a lost friend, and asked to see inside. I opened the door and let them walk the perimeter of the marked safety line like tourists peering into a museum exhibit. The president's face did something I'd only ever seen babies do when food wasn't what they expected. "What is this?" he said, though he knew exactly what it was. "A private recreational structure, not a barn," I said. "You can't do this," he said, waving at the backstop like it had personally offended him. "County says I can. State says you can't say I can't. You told me to take down the barn. I did. Do you want me to paint the posts a different shade? Happy to submit a sample." He wrote me up anyway. The violation this time said, prohibited activity, and listed discharge of firearms within the subdivision. They also fined me for the nerve of painting the trim before they approved the color, which I'd literally pulled from their own design guide. I sent the new violation to the bulldozer attorney. The letter he fired back was the legal version of a deep sigh followed by a truck horn, state preemption, county approval, and a section of the CC, ours, that said if an owner was forced to hire counsel to enforce their rights against the association had to pay the owner's reasonable fees if the owner prevailed. He included the county's letter and a nice paragraph about defamation if the board continued to call my permitted building dangerous in public. They backed off for a week. This is where the compliance part turned malicious without me lifting another tool. See, if I'd been left alone with my barn, I would have kept using it as a workshop. A table saw hums now and then. Nobody cares. But the president wanted the barn gone. He wanted a clear view of the cottonwoods so he could sit on his deck and feel like he owned the whole horizon. He used the letter of his rules to force me to take down what he thought he hated. I took him literally. I set strict hours for myself based on the county's noise ordinance, not HOA preferences. Mid-morning a couple days a week, early evening once or twice. Nothing crazy. I put up a block calendar near the entrance and scheduled practice like workouts. I went through drills, put targets on the clip, and did the thing that helped me relax. Sound baffles did their work. The report was a rounded thud, not a crack. It was legal. It was safe. And it drove the president absolutely out of his mind. Complaint number 1 came the first day I practiced. He called the sheriff. The deputy walked into my yard like a guy who'd done this dance before. He looked at the county letter, looked at the backstop, looked at the safety lines, and said, "You're good." He told the president, in front of 2 neighbors, that it was lawful activity and not his jurisdiction to shut down. The president told the deputy he was friends with the commissioner. The deputy wrote something in his notebook and left. Complaint number 2 was a group email with half the neighborhood CC'd. It accused me of turning the subdivision into a war zone. Someone replied, all asking if the HOA had approved my trim color. Another neighbor, who I'd helped jump a car in the rain, wrote, "It's not loud. I hear lawn blowers more." The president replied, all with a long thing about values and property standards. The board sent a new violation while they reviewed the matter. My attorney sent back a new letter while sipping coffee and probably billing in 6-minute increments. The board scheduled a hearing at the clubhouse. I went, mostly because I knew they wanted me to. The room was packed. People love a show. The president gave a whole speech about how our community had always been peaceful and family-oriented, and how some members were ignoring the spirit of the rules. Then he read from a stack of complaints like he was narrating a crime book. I stood when they let me speak. I said plain, "You told me to take down my barn." I complied. I did exactly what the CCRs allow. I got county approval for the use. I follow the noise hours. I invited the sheriff. I'm doing a legal, safe hobby in a permitted structure. If you don't like the activity, that's not a rule problem. That's a personal problem. Someone in the back clapped. The president banged a little gavel he must have bought online. Then came the part where malicious compliance pays out like a slot machine. The board announced they were proposing an amendment to the CCRs to ban the discharge of firearms anywhere in the subdivision. They wanted a supermajority vote. The president smiled like he could already taste the win. My attorney leaned over before I could stand and whispered, "Let him cook." The board called for community comments. People lined up. A few said they didn't like the idea of a range nearby, even if it wasn't loud. One guy talked about property values, the way people talk about ghosts. Then a woman who lives 2 streets over, who hikes the path behind my lot every day, said she felt safer knowing I practiced because she liked the idea of a neighbor who knows what he's doing. Another guy reminded the room that we already have lawn crews, with equipment that sound like a swarm. A quiet neighbor said she moved out here because city rules were too strict. She didn't want the HOA to out-city the city. Then my attorney stood. He didn't shout. He read from a printout. State preemption. Private property rights. A clause in the CCRs that says amendments cannot remove vested rights of an owner's existing permitted improvement. The county letter. Again. And, almost as an afterthought, the notice that if the association knowingly adopted a rule in conflict with state law, any owner could have it voided in court and recover fees. The board looked like they'd bitten into a lemon. The president tried to salvage it with a vote anyway, and it failed so hard the projector crashed. The next day, the president put a noise meter on a post at the path behind my lot and sent out an email telling everyone he was documenting a nuisance. I took a photo of his meter, sent it to the county with a simple question, and got a reply that made me laugh. Private citizen noise measurements are not official. Only county-calibrated equipment used by county staff qualify. I printed that and taped it next to the calendar inside my door. Within a week, the president was sending me fines for everything except breathing. Use of non-approved recreational facility, failure to get paint color pre-approved, again, creating a nuisance, and endangering the community. The amounts were not small. My attorney sent another letter that said roughly, "Stop." We filed for an internal appeal. I also filed a complaint with the State Department that oversees community associations. I included every violation notice, every screenshot of his emails, every photo of his noise meter, and copies of my county approval. I wasn't angry. I was thorough. Malicious compliance works best when you're cleaner than the sidewalk you stand on. The sheriff came out again. Not because I called, but because the president had called 3 times in a week. The deputy brought a supervisor this time. They both took a look around, ran through the same checklist, then paid more attention to the president, who had parked his truck halfway into my grass near the path and was waving his arms at the baffles like he'd discovered a conspiracy. The supervisor asked him to step back off my property. The president said something about rights. The supervisor pointed at the property line marker. The president took half a step and told them he was going to shut this guy down. The supervisor smiled a tired smile. "You don't have the authority." Word got around. It always does. A couple of neighbors stopped by, curious. I took the time to talk through safety, to show the letter, to explain the hours, to point at the baffles, to walk them through why nothing leaves the building except a dull sound and a whiff of burnt powder that you wouldn't smell unless you were inside. I'm not a recruiter, but I'm not a hermit. I told them if they ever heard something that sounded off or saw something that made them nervous, call me first and the sheriff second. One guy, retired, asked if I'd teach him the basics. I said sure, with strict rules and ear protection and nothing fancy. We scheduled a morning. He brought cookies his wife made. We were done in an hour. He left smiling. He waved at the president when they crossed paths, and the president looked like he'd swallowed a battery. The board tried one more play. They sent out a glossy mailer asking for a vote to restore neighborhood peace and quiet, which I guess meant banning the thing they had no power to ban. The mailer used a stock photo of a person frowning with fingers in their ears. It was silly. It also backfired. People who hadn't paid much attention now paid a lot of attention. They dug into their own rules, found the preemption language I'd been waving around, and started asking why dues were being spent on mailers that did nothing. A guy who actually reads budgets pointed out that legal costs had gone up recently and asked if the board was spending member money on fights they could not win. The treasurer, who up until then had stayed quiet, made a face like she'd smelled something and said, "We should discuss this in executive session." It didn't play well. There's a moment in these stories where the person who thought they were in charge realizes the rule book isn't a magic wand. The president hit that moment when the Department Overseeing Association sent him a letter that basically said, "Knock it off." It cited the same things my attorney had. It reminded him that harassment of a member under the guise of enforcement could get the board in trouble. And it mentioned that if the board continued issuing fines that had no legal basis, they could be forced to refund them with interest and pay my legal fees. He called an emergency board meeting. I didn't go. I worked on my drills. Thump, thump, thump. I went inside, drank water, and checked my email. A notice popped up. Board rescinds fines, pending legal review. Then another, board to hold special election for president position. Then a third from the treasurer, apologizing for recent missteps. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy that sequence. The special election was the social event of the month. People brought folding chairs and popcorn. The president gave a speech about keeping standards high, which translated meant doing whatever I say. Someone asked him how much money had been spent on letters to me. He didn't answer. Someone else asked if he had the legal authority to ban things the state protects. He said he had moral authority, which is not a thing written anywhere as far as I know. The vote was not close. He lost his gavel. The new president was the treasurer, who had never worn mirror sunglasses in her life. She called me the next day. It wasn't a demand. It was a simple, "Can we talk?" We sat on my patio, the barn. That wasn't a barn behind us. She asked if I'd be willing to set some posted hours clear, printed, visible, so nobody had to guess. I pointed at the calendar I already keep posted on the inside wall. She laughed and asked if I'd post the same calendar in the newsletter. I said, sure. She asked if I'd consider hosting a safety talk for any neighbor who wanted to understand what safe looked like. I said I would, with strict rules and no nonsense. We shook hands, and that was that. The old president didn't take it well. He sent snippy emails to anyone who would read them, accused the board of cowardice, said the neighborhood was going downhill. Then he tried one last stunt. He filed a small claims action over nuisance and diminished enjoyment. My attorney shook his head, and we filed a response with the county letter, the state preemption, the noise ordinance, the board's rescission of fines, and a log of my posted hours. The judge looked at the papers for about as long as it takes to move a fly off a sandwich and dismissed it. My attorney filed for fees. The old president paid them out of pocket. He sent one final email that said I was a menace. I printed it and used the back for a shopping list. The funny thing is, after the spectacle died down, the range has been a non-event for most people. I keep my hours. I keep my place cleaner than the board's landscaping crew keeps the common entrance. I wave at hikers on the path and they wave back. The retired guy brings cookies sometimes. One neighbor borrowed my staple gun and returned it the same day, which I consider a rare miracle. If I hear a baby crying through an open window somewhere, I stop for the day because I'm not a monster. If I see a party tent pop up in a backyard on my block calendar day, I adjust. Nobody had to force that. It's called not being a jerk. But let's talk about the meat of it. The malicious compliance the sub loves. The president gave me an order. Take down the barn. He expected ruins and a clear view and a personal victory he could toast from his deck. I complied to the letter. I removed everything that made it a barn. I changed the use with the county. I met every rule written in their laminated pamphlet. He wanted less. He got more. He wanted silence. He got lawful thumps. He wanted control. He got a reminder that control has limits when it comes to other people's property and the actual law. The negative outcome wasn't random. It was predictable to anyone who reads the rules and thinks past the first move. There's a coda here that still makes me shake my head. A few weeks after the special election, I got a letter from the association's insurance carrier. They were auditing claims. It included a note about increased legal spending during the president's last months and asked for documentation. I wasn't the only person he'd been leaning on, it turned out. He'd also gone after a neighbor's shed that held garden tools the rulebook actually allows, and another neighbor's swing set that was 3 inches taller than the guideline. The carrier wasn't thrilled. When insurance companies get unhappy, boards find religion fast. The new president sent out a memo about returning to fair enforcement. I sent back a reply that said, appreciated. On a quiet evening, I stood in the middle of my not a barn and looked at the backstop. The air smelled faintly of oil and sawdust. The calendar had my next practice blocked out. The photo of Kid Me with the paper target hung on the side wall. A crooked little reminder that some things stick even when the paint peels. My wife leaned on the doorway and asked if I wanted dinner. I said yes. We ate on the patio. A jogger went by on the path and waved. Somewhere, a lawn crew was still hammering away at hedges with blowers that sound like jet engines. The world hadn't ended. The sky hadn't fallen. The neighborhood was fine. The old president started putting his house up for sale not long after. The listing used words like serene and picturesque and carefully cropped out the barn. That wasn't. He hosted an open house on a day I'd scheduled practice, and I didn't change my calendar for him because he was not on my list of people I do favors for. The thumps were dull and regular. The realtor looked annoyed. The buyers looked curious. A neighbor laughed into a cup. The house didn't sell that day. It sold later, after he dropped the price. He moved away. Someone new moved in. They came by to introduce themselves and ask if we liked the pizza place by the gas station. We do. They brought a 6-pack and said the backyard between our places had enough shade for a grill. We talked about everything except rules. I don't know if this will end up being the most dramatic story to anyone else. It doesn't have a courtroom brawl or a marching band. It has something I like better, a slow, steady win by just doing what I was told, exactly how it was written, and letting the fallout hit the person who thought rules were a weapon you swing at other people but never at yourself. The barn they hated turned into something they hated more, and the law shrugged and let it happen because that's how the law works when you respect it. I promised the neighbors who came to the safety talk that the range would never be a free-for-all. I keep that promise. I promised myself I wouldn't let someone who loves clipboards more than common sense tell me what my property is for when he doesn't have the authority. I keep that promise too. It turns out you can live in peace, even in a place with signs at the entrance and yard flags that all match, as long as you know where the boundaries are and you're willing to stand exactly on them without stepping over. The weirdest part? Every now and then when I'm sweeping the slab or fixing a squeak in the door, I catch myself feeling grateful to the old president. If he hadn't pushed, I might have left the barn as a workshop forever, always telling myself I'd get around to my dream later. He forced my hand, and I ended up with a place that makes me breathe slower in the best way. It's hard to call it a gift because he didn't mean it that way, but that's how malicious compliance works sometimes. Someone tries to close a door, you take it off the hinges, and suddenly, the room has more light. There's one last thread to tie up. The board's accounting of legal fees came out at the end of the quarter. They'd paid my attorney's invoices the way they were required to when they rescinded the fines and backed off. The new president wrote a little note in the newsletter about learning and listening. It was nice. It also came with a policy that any change to a rule would be posted for comment for a real period of time, not over a weekend when nobody checks email. People clapped at the next meeting. Real claps, not sarcastic ones. And the barn? It's still there. Not a barn, technically. A private recreational structure. It's the quietest, loud thing in the neighborhood. It looks good in the evening when the sun hits the wood and the shadows of the cottonwoods stretch long across the lawn. If you stand on the path and listen, you'll hear the usual things. Dogs, blowers, kids, someone telling someone they can't park like that. Sometimes, on a posted hour, you'll hear a measured set of thumps spaced like breathing. In, out, in, out. Legal, safe, and exactly the kind of thing you get when you tell a stubborn person to take down the barn without thinking about what those words can mean. I didn't set out to be the neighborhood story people whisper about at block parties. I set out to be left alone. But if you hand me a rule and insist I follow it, I will. I'll follow it so hard the rule becomes a mirror. And if you don't like what's looking back at you, that's between you and your gavel. I've got a calendar to update and targets to replace, and a treasurer-turned-president who waves when she jogs by. The world spins either way. If there's a moral, it's not fancy. Read the rules. Don't bluff with something you haven't read yourself. Don't assume you can vote away state law. And if you don't want someone to do something, don't tell them to do the thing that clears their path. The president told me to take down my barn. I did exactly that. What I put up in its place was mine, legal, and, to a certain kind of person, poetic. Not that I'm big on poetry. I'm big on posted hours and ear protection and the quiet satisfaction that comes from winning by obeying orders. The sub calls it malicious compliance. Around here, I call it Tuesday. Anyway, thank you for watching. See you again tomorrow.